other international organizations, and they were describing the situation in Gaza over a sustained period of time, which was inhuman. And most of the young men who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they had been born into a concentration camp. And as of October 6th, the very high probability was that they were going to die in that concentration camp. And I found it very hard to facilely condemn them. I said condemn them because I don't have any difficulty in condemning atrocities, the targeting of civilians. I'll even be honest with you, I do try to stick to the international law, but let's say 400 of the combatants that were killed, if they were combatants who were just attending a music festival, I actually don't think their lives should have been lost. So I have sympathy both for the actual civilians who were killed, but the category of combatants can also, I think, obscure some realities. So if some soldier was taking his time off to attend a music festival, in my mind, and we can obviously disagree, I would still classify them as a civilian. That's how I see it. I recognize that's not the legal denotation, but in my own moral calculus. And so I have no problem condemning the atrocities, but I did recoil at condemning the perpetrators of the atrocities. And that was a moral struggle for me, and those days were not easy because I couldn't find my way. Again, I'll freely admit that even though I am fairly confident of my competence in the facts of a situation, I'm not very confident of my moral judgment. I take the life of the mind very seriously, and I know moral philosophy is a significant intellectual endeavor, and I wasn't confident that I was equipped mentally to pass a judgment here. My usual recourse, I'm not proud of it, I'm not ashamed of it, my usual recourse for the past 40 years was to defer to the judgment of Professor Chomsky, because he was, in his intellectual equipment, he was steeped in Western philosophy, and not just Western philosophy, in Hebrew philosophy. And he had my experience, he had exemplary moral judgment. But at that particular moment, he wasn't available to me. And I felt this sudden huge burden because I recognized many people were waiting to hear what I had to say. And I really wasn't sure. I knew what my gut feeling told me. As I said, I recoiled from condemning them, even as I recognized atrocities of a significant magnitude had occurred. And it happened that in recent years, I had put the Israel-Palestine conflict behind me, and I did start to do fairly significant reading on the African-American history. And I remembered, as most people, or quite a number of people here will remember, that we had our own slave revolts in the United States, and that they were very ugly. I went back and I started to read about things like the Nat Turner rebellion. And Nat Turner, he was a slave. He was a very smart guy. Everyone, white and black, said, this Nat Turner is a very clever fellow. And he was torn by the reality of this huge chasm that separated his potential as a human being from the reality that he would be a slave from the day he was born to the day he died, and none of his potential would ever be realized. And at some point, Mr. Turner, who was a religious fanatic of the first degree, Mr. Turner gathered around him others. They plotted a slave rebellion. They went out, and the order Nat Turner gave was kill all whites. That was the order. Kill all whites. And that's what they proceeded to do. They went from house to house, chopped off the heads of babies. That's literally true. They beheaded babies. They shattered skulls. And it was ugly. I would say in some respects, not in terms of numbers, but actions. In some respects, it was worse than October 7th. The numbers vastly differed. There was about 60 whites that were killed before they were suppressed. So now I had in my mind an analogy. The question now I turned to was, okay, let me see how the abolitionists, the judgment they rendered on Nat Turner. And the first person I looked at was William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator. And it was kind of, if I can use the expression, it was a kind of eureka moment for me. Garrison said, no question, horrors occurred during Nat Turner's rebellion. Horrible things happened. But it's very noticeable when you read his post-mortem, he never condemns Nat Turner. Read it yourself, it's easily available. What he does is he condemns his fellow whites. He kept saying, he begins his post-mortem and ends it by saying, we told you so. We told you so. We told you, if you treat people like that, at some point, you will reap what you have sown. And as I said, that was a kind of epiphany for me, a eureka moment, because I felt now I had the right framework for trying to understand what happened, which is you condemn what happened and don't pretend it didn't happen. On the other hand, William Lloyd Garrison just didn't have it in him, knowing what it meant to be a slave. He didn't have it in him to condemn Nat Turner. And it was the same thing with me. A large part of what I've written the last 10 and 15 years was just chronicling that horror, not just the horror of being born in there, the horror of no future, the horror of no past, the horror of no present. There were also those periodic mowings of the lawn, what Israel calls its operations, the periodic high-tech massacres, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, the horrors of life in a concentration camp, compounded by the horrors of those periodic mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And it's not entirely incorrect. In fact, I think it's close to reality for those who recoil at what Hamas did on October 7th. From their point of view, it was their mowing of the lawn. You want to use that pathological, that diabolical, that utterly sick metaphor of mowing the lawn. That lawn, one half of the blades on that lawn, one half of the blades on that lawn are children. Gaza is about 50% children and about 70% refugees and the descendants of refugees from 1948. So if you find it amusing to talk about mowing the lawn, Hamas was just as amused when it mowed the lawn on October 7th. The Israeli reaction had three components to it. The first component is straightforward. It was bloodlust, revenge. We will revenge what happened on October 7th. And I'm sure everybody will recognize that's not exactly a sentiment alien to the hearts of most human beings. The revenge here, however, had a second aspect to it. It was the outrage, the fury that these Untermenschen, these subhumans in Gaza, had on October 7th outsmarted the Israeli Übermenschen, the Israeli supermen. Israel had, particularly in my generation, Israel had the image of, you can call it a James Bond writ large. The commando operations, most of you will know, I suspect, that the current Prime Minister's, Mr. Netanyahu's brother was famously killed during the commando raid on Entebbe, and the whole country had projected this image of a cutting-edge James Bond, high-tech, super surveillance country. And lo and behold, on October 7th, this ragtag army of Untermenschen, of subhumans, had outsmarted them, outwitted them, humiliated them. And so the bloodlust revenge was compounded and exacerbated by the desire to exact revenge for the humiliation that had been visited on the Israeli high-tech James Bond society. The second concern in the Israeli response was the fear of the loss of its deterrence capability. Deterrence capability or deterrence capacity, which is a crucial component of Israeli military doctrine and political doctrine, is very simple. It's a fancy term, but all it means is the Arab world's fear of Israel. Israel has always felt, or for all of its modern history, has felt that in order to keep the Arabs in their place, we have to have them dread the prospect of Israeli retaliation, the fear. After October 7th, I am fully willing to admit Israel did have a significant security problem on its hands. The problem was it suddenly dawned on many Arabs and Muslims that, hey, maybe Israel isn't as invincible as we thought. And maybe there is a military option against them. Up until that moment, with the single exception of the Hezbollah, which had claimed or said openly, in the words of Sayed Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, that Israel, he famously said after the Battle of Bin Shabil in 2006, he said, Israel is a spider's web. You just blow on it, you just blow on it and it will disappear. But that was definitely not the predominant view in the Arab Muslim world. The view was Israel was invincible, militarily invincible. And suddenly, on October 7th, as I said, it began to dawn on the Arab Muslim world, the popular level. Maybe it isn't all that strong. I remember, if I could just give a brief anecdote, a few days ago, a little more than a week ago, I was on a debate with Israel's senior historian, Benny Morris. And I mentioned this fact about Israel's deterrence capacity having collapsed on October 7th, and the Arab world now thinking, hey, maybe we can militarily defeat them. I was very struck by his response. He laughed. I thought a kind of nervous laugh, but that's my opinion. And he said, well, we have nuclear bombs. And what struck me about that answer was he didn't gloat about the army. He didn't say we have the IDF, we have the Air Force, he didn't. He immediately reached for the nuclear bombs because it had apparently or seemed to have sunk into him that the IDF isn't as powerful as we thought. So the insane reaction by Israel after October 7th, it was also an effort to restore its deterrence capacity, to transmit to the Arab world the message, if you mess with us, we'll turn your country into Gaza. And the third component, there is the bloodlust, the deterrence capability or capacity. The third component, in my opinion, is the most important one. I don't want to trivialize the first two. That is, everybody knows the cliche that every crisis is an opportunity. And the Israelis realized on October 7th, as Mao Zedong used to say, how to turn a bad thing into a good thing. They were going to use what happened on October 7th to finally, once and for all, put an end to the Gaza problem. For those of you who know the history, the people in Gaza have always refused, in quite militant ways, to acquiesce in their fate, the fate of being born, living, and dying in a concentration camp. And now, because of October 7th, Israel envisaged that it's time for, and you'll excuse the obvious analogy, it was time for the final solution to the Gaza question. And what was the solution? I would say the solution fell on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum was to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And that seemed to be their goal the first week or so, when they thought they could sweep the entire population into the Egyptian Sinai. Those plans were foiled by the Egyptian president, who said, we are not going to solve your Gaza problem. It's not going to be at our expense. That's one point on the spectrum. The middle point of the spectrum was to make Gaza uninhabitable. As Giora Eiland put it at one point, the former head of the National Security Council, not now, but he's still prominent. He's an advisor to the Defense Minister Gallant. He said, we will give the people of Gaza two choices. Choice one, stay and starve. And choice two, to leave, to make Gaza uninhabitable. And the third point on the spectrum is to just carry out a genocide without any elaboration and without any subtlety. I would say it's still an open question how it will end. It's possible that enough pressure will be exerted on President Sisi to open the Rafah Gate and expel the population. It's possible that we will be entering a period, judging by all international UN and humanitarian organizations, in which a large part of the population will starve to death. That's a significant possibility. I don't know better than anyone here, for those of you who have studied these matters and have attempted to, the way the international organizations classify hunger, starvation, famine. It's a complex formula, and I can never commit it to memory. What's certain is, as Human Rights Watch put it about 2 months ago, and as all UN officials without exception are putting it now, starvation is being used as a weapon. It's a calculated, premeditated attempt to starve the people of Gaza. If you read the New York Times yesterday, they had a long article trying to persuade readers that the problem in Gaza is a technical one. How to deliver the goods, the roads are old, the inspections can be protracted. It's not a technical question. If you look at the statements by the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Mr. Borrell, if you look at the statements by Mr. Lazzarini, the head of the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, if you look at the statements even by Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, it's a calculated policy. This is not a technical challenge. It's a political policy by the State of Israel to, as Human Rights Watch put it, and then the Foreign Policy Chief, Borrell, put it, it's a calculated weapon using starvation as a method and mode of warfare. I'll look at one last question, and then I'll proceed to talk with Chris. And the question is, how do we assess at this point in time the significance of what happened on October 7th? I remember my good friend, Mowing Rabbani, he said to me, it's a game changer. And I was very hesitant to agree to that because I had seen many massacres come and go, and I had chronicled them, and I was, at least at the beginning, inclined to another bloodletting, and then we move on. I was wrong. I have no problem saying that. I would say the following things changed. Number one, I think we are at an end, at least provisionally, to any diplomacy to resolve the conflict. The talk about two states at this point is completely ridiculous. There is no diplomatic solution on the horizon. On the one hand, Israel is determined it's going to exact a military victory, and it's not going to retreat from that goal. If they manage to achieve a military victory, then they will almost certainly and expeditiously move on to extract another military victory from the Hezbollah. So on their side, it's quite clear, though it's true to say how you define a military victory has gray areas. On the other side, the party of God, the Hezbollah, has made absolutely clear, we will not accept a military defeat for Hamas. That will not happen. And as anybody here understands, those two goals are zero-sum. They are irreconcilable. And it's also true to say that after the horrors of the past 5 months, a realization has set in a large part of the Arab world, the Muslim world. You cannot live with that state. It's impossible. That state has got to go. It's a lunatic state. And for that reason as well, it doesn't seem that a political solution is possible in the short term. The other change is, I think, for the first time in my lifetime, Israel is now facing a legitimation crisis. Up until this moment, the state of Israel itself was not called into question within the broad mainstream. What was called into question was the occupation. I would say now the state of Israel itself has been called into question, its legitimacy. And I'll just suggest 2 pieces of evidence for that. Piece of evidence number 1, it's very striking that the country in the world that decided to take up the cause of Gaza was South Africa. Because South Africa has always been the model pointed to by critics of Israel as the preferable ideal. One state for the people. And it's hard not to notice that the country which represents the one state ideal is now the chief representative of the Palestinian cause at the International Court of Justice. The second second indication to me, I was very struck and surprised by Senator Schumer's speech last week. Senator Schumer has always been a fanatical supporter of the state of Israel. In fact, in 2010, he already was advocating what Israel decided to do. He said, we should economically strangle Gaza. And as you will all remember, or some of you will remember, Senator Schumer and New Jersey Senator Menendez were the 2 main Democrats who opposed the deal with Iran. He was effectively the spokesperson for the state of Israel in our country. And the speech was very interesting, just on 3 points. Point number 1, he was very careful to allocate equal responsibility on both sides. He said Hamas had to go and the Palestinian Authority had to go, at least under Abbas. And then he said Netanyahu has to go and the far right has to go. He made it exactly even, his allocation of responsibility. Coming from Schumer, unthinkable. And then it was very interesting how he addressed criticism of Israel. He said, it's not fair to call Israel a settler state, or nowadays the jargon is settler colonial state. He said it's not fair because we have these longings from 3,000 years ago. I won't go into that. But he didn't dismiss the claim as being anti-Semitic, as being lunatic. He felt the need to rationally refute the claim. And then the second point was he had to address the question of one state. And it was very interesting. Far from calling one state anti-Semitic, he said, I understand that many idealistic young people believe in the idea of one state and everyone living together. I don't agree, he said, but I understand it. And that was a signal, in my view, that Senator Schumer realized that a large part of his Democratic Party constituency regards that as a legitimate goal, and that he can't dismiss it as anti-Semitic without dismissing a significant part of the Democratic Party base. And so that was an indirect realization that Israel is now facing, as a Jewish state, Israel is a Jewish state, not just the occupation. Israel as a Jewish state is facing a real legitimation crisis. Okay, thank you.